All right, so this is Atramashwep, and today I'll be discussing a little bit about paper one as well as paper two of English literature, GCSE AQA board. And if you're watching this video, then definitely you are here for a trial lesson for the workshop that is going to happen in real time, a 4-day workshop. All right, so this is paper one, and it is divided into section A and B, Shakespeare and the 19th century novel, in which Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet would be discussed in great detail, and all the questions pertaining to it, as well as a 19th century novel. I would be giving more notes and detailed discussions on Jane Eyre, right? And yeah, so these two links that are followed by the headings at the top actually tell you a little bit about what the poetic devices and the terminologies that are going to be used in governing your answers. All right, you need to have a very firm grip on them, and all those poetic devices, including sibilants and mm, and personification, right? And dramatic monologues, ironies, and all of that is supposed to be on the tips of your um, fingers. And so this is what we are going to discuss in great detail. But today we are going to understand what the pattern is and then analyze some questions of a specific poem from the olden times. All right, now this is part two, which is again bifurcated into section A, section B, and section C. Section A being the modern texts, in which we are going to study a little bit about um, The Lord of the Flies by William Golding, right? And all the subtexts and the themes that are involved when we are talking about that masterpiece. All right. Then we have poetry section, in which we are going to mainly focus on the power and conflict section, not the love and relationships. Instead, we are going to focus on all the poems that are related to power and conflict and how these poems can be compared with each other, as this is the most common question regarding them, which you will commonly see in past papers, right? And then we have unseen poetry, and then unseen poetry's comparison with the actual poetry. Poetry discussions of the poems from Power and Conflict. Okay, all right. So these are a few poems that you may have studied, and so these are also the poems that we are going to discuss in great detail in those four workshop sessions. So the first one being Percy B. Shelley, Ozymandias, and there's this one by Robert Browning, My Last Teacher. So today our agenda for the next 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes, is discussing a little bit about My Last Touches and what does it involve when we come across questions related to it in paper two. So basically, My Last Stitches was written by Robert Browning, and it's a very in this poem has a mysterious ambience to it, right? And it's written by a famous English poet, a playwright as well. Now you may be noticing how Shakespeare also happens to be an English poet and a playwright, and Robert Browning wrote My Last Touches, a famous dramatic monologue of a duke about a heinous act of killing his former wife. Now, what might be a dramatic monologue here? A dramatic monologue is simply we divide the words that we do not understand or seem difficult to our minds into two, and we discuss them in that section. All right. So monologue basically is when you're talking to yourself. Now, when there is a monologue, a poem is a monologue. It is actually signifying that the main character in the poem is talking to himself or herself. And if it's dramatic monologue, then it has a certain sort of hyperbole going on and something that has a very tragic end, or it has a completely new ring to it where there's conflict involved and there's plot twist involved, right? There's an element of surprise at the end, at the middle of it, or wherever. So dramatic monologue is something that has a poem, a type of poem that has the main character speaking about something. All right, to himself mostly. It's composed of all the dialogue of a single person. Okay, so here this poem is of a duke, and he has apparently killed his former wife, and this is the conflict here. And it was published in Browning's dramatic lyrics in 1842. The poem comprises the sentiment of the speaker whose mistress could not survive his severity. It also provides an insight into the psychological state of the speaker. However, its popularity lies in the presentation of a realistic picture of the Victorian era. So while we are at it and discussing and reading about the literary pieces, what we do is we also discuss and try to remember the background that is attached with that poem, and not just the poem in itself, but a little bit about the author or the poet as well. So this is related to the Victorian era, back when there were kings and queens and duchesses, right, and dukes, and there was crime. There was a certain degree of crime that was practiced, right, and it was very rampant in that age. And so we need to keep that background in our at the back of our mind when we are attempting questions related to Victorian era. All right, so these are two of the most common questions that we deal with when we are attempting paper two. So, what exactly is the conflict in the poem My Last Touches, and how is power and conflict shown in My Last Touches? So, since it is the subdivision, it's a subcategory of power and conflict, we see that the conflict within the poem is very subtle but displays itself in the power of the Duke that he has over the Duchess's life. There is also a conflict between how the Duke presents himself to the world, to the outside world, versus Duke's true character. Right, so here it's simply how he has this hypocritic character, and how he has turned it into such that the audience knows that he is very cunning and sly, but the other person who he is referring to, or his monologue is directed to, does not really know what is happening, right? And this is how the power and conflict is very rampant here. Okay, so the other question is, what exactly is the conflict in the poem My Last Duchess? My Last Duchess dramatizes the internal conflict of the speaker, the Duke of Ferrara. He is conflict with the faults of his last wife and the desire for change in the upcoming marriage to his new fiancée. Now, these polygamies were very rampant back in the age, right? And this is what it's telling us about the irony of the fact that he has already killed his last wife, and he is still seeking to find a wife that is, meeting his standards and someone who he could correct, right? And which has a very diabolical ring to it. Ultimately, the struggle deals with power and jealousy. Okay. So, power and jealousy would also be viewed as a theme of this poem, a very key theme of this poem, which we are going to study a little later. All right. So, my last riches as a representative of jealousy here, it is the poem presents a monologue of a duke who is telling about the demise of his last touches. At the outset, he displays a painting la of his late wife and talks about her character traits. First, he acknowledges the mastery of the painter for painting a lifelike picture of his mistress. So this poem basically opens with a painter, with him presenting the painter as if he is one of the best of his kind, and then he starts accusing his own mistress for having a heart that was too soulmate, glad, and too easily impressed. He did not like her soft, impartial, and polite manners. He goes so far as to insinuate that his wife was having an affair with the painter himself, and that is a little too much, right? That's hyperbole, and it has a huge diabolical ring to it. And all these things, these representations, you are going to be mentioning when you are specifically told about to discuss themes and the representation of either um, the speaker himself, the Duke himself, or if they're asking you to discuss jealousy within the poem. And supported, always supported with the evidence, right? We have here these evidences that are enclosed in inverted commas, and that is exactly how you're going to mention them. Not entire, um, not entire verses, but parts and phrases of the verses that you think are relevant to the answer. Anyway, although her death is suspicious, the Duke gets away with her murder on account of his status and power. And this is also true to the fact, this is telling you, this is evidence of the fact that power and conflict is pretty rampant in this poem. Thus, the poem exhibits the vicious, psychotic, and controlling mind of the Duke who hated his wife due to her positive nature. Okay, so this is the themes we already discussed. Jealousy, hatred, and power are the major themes of this poem. Browning has presented the character of Duke who wants to rule his woman with an iron fist. He talks about his late wife and details the reasons why he did not like her. He could not tolerate the idea that his wife was easily attracted towards the strangers and responded them happily. So this is the element of jealousy we were talking about earlier. It is due to this behavior his wife is not alive. That is why he seems to be a psychopath, jealous, and self-centered man who not only wishes to control his kingdom but also wants to govern the lives of his near and dear ones. So his attractive wife had this the sole sin of being attractive and beautiful and charming to the eye. And so he killed her because he could not bear anybody else um, seeking to admire her beauty. Right. So this is also attributive of the fact that patriarchal family structures were very rampant in that age. Patriarchy, meaning to say a male centered society, which only supported the males, and they got away with everything that they did in the name of honor, in the name of love, and in the name of jealousy. They got away with pretty much everything. So these are some of the themes that you're going to be discussing when you are presented with these questions. Okay, so this is the analysis in which we will discuss assonance and symbolism. Now, what specific symbols that are being used here? The painting of the Duke's last chest symbolizes how he objectifies women as a property or possession. This is a very clever, uh, a clever molding of how symbolism is used in this specific poem, right? The painting, white mule symbolizes her innocence and purity. Taming a seahorse is a symbol of Duke taming his wife. Again, patriarchal patterns. Okay, then there is enjambment. Now, what exactly is enjambment? It refers to the continuation or a sentence without the pause beyond the end of line, couplet, or stanza. Now, when a certain stanza or a verse is continuing without stopping, without maintaining a rhythm that is matching with the other line, we see the pattern of enjambment. And this is pretty common in poems that are related to power and conflict, where their enjambment is seeking to exhibit chaos in the poem, right? It's symbolizing chaos. Then we have consonance and irony and simile, which is easy to find. Consonance meaning to say that there's a repetition of the consonant sounds together down, sir, notice Neptune, though. Then we have irony, that is another figure of speech, right, that is used. And we see that where the audience knows something and the other characters in the poem do not. That is what irony seems to suggest, something that is not congruent with the actual happenings from that of fiction or from that of a fictitious nature is called an irony. Then we have simile. Simile is simply the comparisons between two situations using the words between the two situations, two words with like, as, and but. like an as mainly. That's my last stitches painted on the wall, looking as if she were alive. Then there is a very rampant use of hyperbole here, exaggeration simply. She looked on and her looks went everywhere. It's not actually something that's happening, it's just something that is being exaggerated to the point that it looks ridiculous. And maybe the poet is not trying to make that point. Then we have alliteration, simply repetition of sounds, similar sounds, not exactly consonant sounds. These sounds could also be vowel sounds. And specifically when there's a repetition of vowel sounds, we call that assonance. Then we have euphemisms. Euphemism is simply a polite expression for someone doing something heinous or something that is very grave, very serious. And so we use it sometimes, like, say, for example, if someone is dying, we are not going to say outright that, oh, they died. Maybe they passed on, okay? Or they uh, may they rest in peace. So this is an example, an excellent example of euphemism. And here in this poem, we have a use of a euphemism, much the same smile. This grew, I gave commands, then all smiles stopped together. There she stands. And so this is a euphemism for death, for killing her. Then all smiles stopped together. So that is how we analyze the different techniques that are being used throughout this poem. And here our session ends. All right. And hopefully you got hooked on and you want to know more about this poem and along with them all the others. And so I'm really hoping to meet you this month, later this month, and we'll be discussing more exciting poems and more exciting ways of attempting the answers. Take care and meet you soon.